Over the past 2 weeks, we have begun to study the Protestant Reformation. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the life of Martin Luther and the followers that came after him, of course, the Lutherans and the Lutheran Church. And then last week, we looked at the life of John Calvin. So if you think of Calvin and Luther as being continental reformers, that is to say, reformers on the continent of Europe, we're going to look at the Reformation as it developed further west, namely in what we call Great Britain today, England, Ireland, and Scotland. So you had Luther and Calvin on the continent. And then this is what a historian by the name of J.J. Scarisbrick wrote about the man who started the Reformation in England. He was to grow into a rumbumptious, isn't that a great word? You know what it means, by the way? It means very similar to another word that looks like it. Rambunctious. Try to fit that into a sentence this week and you get a star, rumbumptious. He was to grow into a rumbumptious, noisy, unbuttoned, prodigal man, the bluff King Hal of legend, exulting in his magnificent physique, boisterous animal exercise, orgies of gambling and eating, lavish clothes. Quoting one, his fingers were one mass of jeweled rings, and around his neck he wore a gold collar, from which hung a diamond as big as a walnut, wrote the Venetian ambassador of him. He loved to dress up, and his wardrobe, ablaze with jewels of all description, and cloth of gold, rich silks, satins, and highly colored feathers, constantly astounded beholders. He was a man who lived with huge, extroverted ebullience, at least in the earlier part of his life, reveling in spectacular living, throwing away money amidst his courtiers on cards, tennis, and dicing, dazzling his vision. And then I love this sentence. Many readers will have their chosen picture of him, Henry, cocksure, and truculent. So that's quite a description of Henry the Eighth. That's exactly right. The King of England, written by arguably his best biographer. You can kind of think of Henry VIII as a counterpart to Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, but only in the sense that he was the one who initiated the Reformation in his land. But if you look at Henry and from any other perspective, he's extraordinarily different in terms of theology, his character, and his aims and his reasons for starting the Reformation. However, God is sovereign even over reformations, and God used a lot of evil in the heart and the intentions of Henry VIII to do a lot of good for the people of his kingdom. Now, the issue that brought about England's separation from the Roman Catholic Church, it began about 10 years before Luther nailed his theses on the door at Wittenberg in the mid to the late 1520s. What year was it Luther nailed his theses on the door of the church? 1517, right? We just went through the 500th anniversary of that event. So this was about 8 to 10 years later that this issue started. And the problem with Henry VIII is that his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was unable to bear him a son, right? And so that put the continuation of his family's line in jeopardy. And the Tudor line in jeopardy. So Catherine of Aragon gave birth to 8 children, but only one of them survived, and that was a female. Her name was Mary. Now, she later would take the throne, which is what we'll come to in a few minutes. So he wanted to ensure his family's stability on the throne, and so he sought a divorce from Catherine, and he fell for a lady who was there in the court, whose name was Anne Boleyn. So Henry's quest to divorce Catherine and find a wife who could give him a male heir became known as the king's great matter. It was something that was sort of spoken of in hushed tones, right? It's kind of a euphemism. We need to deal with the king's great matter. We need to find some way to settle this. But there was a huge problem with this. You see, the matter with the king's great matter is that divorce was virtually non-existent in those days and only could be permitted with the direct permission of the Pope. And the Pope wasn't prepared to grant him a divorce or an annulment You understand the difference between divorce and annulment, right? A divorce is an officially recognized marriage that falls apart. An annulment is when you say, well, it wasn't really ever a marriage, so it's not a divorce, right? So that's the difference between those things. Well, Henry was smitten by God, and he had a fit of moral conscience. He realized that for all the years that he'd been married to Catherine, he realized that they were living in sin. Now, why did he propose this as the way of getting out of his marriage? Well, he cited the Bible. He cited Leviticus 20, verse 21, which forbids this the practice of marrying your brother's widow. Okay, so Leviticus speaks about that. And he took this to the Pope and he said, my conscience, I'm heartbroken to learn that I have been sinning all of these years. So please grant me the annulment/divorce. Well, the Pope was no fool and he didn't fall for it. Leaving out lots of detail, the Pope said no, and Henry basically said, well, if you're not going to grant me the divorce that I want, that's fine. I'll start my own church, which that's happened time and again, hasn't it, in Protestantism? Well, fine, but we'll start our own thing. Well, that was Henry's attitude. And so in 1534, Henry issued the Act of Supremacy and declared himself, quote, the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. So he started the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. The same year, the Treasons Act was passed and made it a capital crime to refuse to acknowledge the king as such, namely as the head of the Church of England. So what he did is he dissolved the convents where the nuns lived and the monasteries where the monks lived, and with the exception of some of the large ones. So it was all the smaller monasteries and convents. He dissolved. He basically it was wholesale plunder. He just took whatever he wanted out of these closed institutions. Now, for this, the Pope excommunicated, but Henry didn't mind one little bit. We won't dwell on Henry's wives, but I'll just mention a few of their names very quickly. Henry married Anne Boleyn just 5 days after the annulment from Catherine of Aragon, and she gave birth to a girl who later became queen. She was Queen Elizabeth, obviously not the second, but Queen Elizabeth I. But no boy. Anne Boleyn didn't give birth to a boy. He accused her of adultery, and he had her beheaded in 1536. 13 days later, he married Jane Seymour, so his third wife. And finally, Henry got his boy, and he was named Edward. And he ended up becoming king after Henry passed away for a short time. Jane, sadly, she lost her life. She died, I guess you could say, at least of natural causes. She died as a result of complications for giving birth to Edward. Henry had three more wives whose names were Anne of Cleves, Catherine Parr, and Catherine Howard. Now, very graciously of Henry, of these three, only one died from being beheaded, and that was Catherine Howard. When you fill out a form for life insurance, you put your name and information, and there's always a box like, do you skydive? Do you scuba dive? In the 1530s, I'm sure there was a box that said, are you married to Henry VIII? So if so, we're not going to give you life insurance, So though Henry had broken with the Catholic Church, he was not at heart a Protestant. It really was a matter of convenience. This was really a battle between he and the Pope, and a battle of the two, the pride of the two. He wanted to do what he wanted to do, and so he broke away. But at root, he was still, as I say, a Roman Catholic. Now, when Henry VIII died, for 20 years, the whole English nation went back and forth between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, depending on who was on the throne, until eventually it was settled and it was established that Protestantism would be the faith of the realm. A little bit after this, thanks, Jeff, appreciate it. A little bit after this, there was a principle. I believe it was at the Treaty of Westphalia, which was a religious. Which was a kind of a religious settlement, and the expression is "cuius regio eius religio." In Latin, it means whose realm, whose religion. And the idea is there was an agreement at that time that the whole nation would abide by and adopt the faith of the king or the queen, the monarch, right? So in those days, I mean, there was utter joining of church and state, no separation of church and state. We've talked about that's a recent, a modern, and a new phenomenon, that these things should be separated. So anyway, for 20 years, it was really in a great question. Is England going to go back to the Catholic Church? Or is England going to break away and do Protestantism? Or are the English ever the, I don't want to say, I have to be very careful. I don't know who's watching these things. Wanting to be conciliatory, maybe find a middle way between the two, and to go ahead and cut to the chase. That's exactly what they ended up doing with Anglicanism. So when Henry died in January of 1547, his son Edward VI became the boy king at only 9 years of age. In reality, Henry, before he passed, he designated 16 executors who really were the ones who oversaw the realm, since his son was so young when he officially became king. Now, under Edward, really under these executors, England moved in a truly Protestant direction. Marriage of priests was permitted. The cup, that is the communion cup, was granted. It was given back to the laity, to the lay people. In the Act of Uniformity in 1549, it prescribed the use of the Book of Common Prayer, which was written by Thomas Cranmer. The Book of Common Prayer, the second edition anyway, and the 39 Articles of the Church of England are actually Calvinistic. I don't know if you know that. Most people in the Church of England, and Anglicans, and certainly Episcopalians, which are North American Anglicans, are not Calvinists, right? But I sometimes remind Anglican friends, I say, you're supposed to be a Calvinist, right? I think it was only in the last 20 years that the Church of England, frankly, kind of owned up to the fact that they didn't really care about a lot of these old things, and they said, it's not necessary to subscribe to the Book of Common Prayer or to the 39 Articles anymore. Now, the poor Edward, he only reigned 6 years, and he died when he was 15. So Henry VIII was never able to have a viable son anyway. He did have some viable daughters. So when Edward passed, this put his half-sister on the throne, Mary. Remember, this was the girl that Catherine of Aragon gave birth to. Sorry, you don't know this, but I'm perplexed and really bothered. I have so many visuals and pictures that I put in here, and they have disappeared. I have no idea where they went. So anyway, but you can imagine a queen named Mary sitting there, can't you? I'm really bothered. I don't know. Maybe I confused my files. Well, anyway, Queen Mary was a devout Roman Catholic. Okay, so under Edward, Protestantism moved forward, but then Mary comes to the throne. She was a devout Roman Catholic, and her full intention was to bring the English back to subjection underneath the papacy. That was her goal. That was her full purpose. And so what she did is she undid all of these Protestant changes that had been acted under the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. She undid all of those changes. Like, let's forget about this Protestantism. Let's go back to our home at Rome. And so she thought that the best way to do that would be to make an example of the heretics. And so she ended up burning almost 300 Protestants at the stake for their Protestant convictions. So in 1555, she burned close to 300 Protestants at the stake, including Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. Now, we call it the Marian persecution. The persecution under Mary, it gave rise to John Foxe writing his immortal Acts and Monuments, which is we call the Foxe's Book of Martyrs, that was written in 1563. Now, in October, we at least have one picture, and this is, wow, this must be an old iteration of this file. I apologize. Well, anyway, on October 16th, 1555, Ridley and Latimer were executed in Oxford, England. As the two men were tied to the stake, Latimer said these immortal words. He said, "Be of good comfort and play the man." What does play the man mean? Be brave. Be brave. Play the man, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out. Isn't that awesome? And I think that it's fair to say that's what happened. I mean, the Reformation really took as a result of that persecution. Now, this is me on the very spot where these men were burned, on the street in Oxford with a friend of mine. Nicole and I were visiting when we lived there. Now, the persecution, ironically, it had the very opposite effect that Mary desired and designed by the persecution, right? So what it meant is that all of the English, they so wholly rejected Roman Catholicism as a result of this that there was never a serious threat that the English would be under the Pope anymore. J.I. Packer, he has a very memorable statement that I remember in his class on the Puritans. He says this. He says, the English might not be a very godly lot, but they made it quite clear that they didn't want to have anything to do with a version of Christianity that burned Protestants for their sincere convictions. And that's true. So we might say that the upshot of this is that England would forever be a Protestant nation, or at least not a Catholic nation. Now, 3 years later, Mary died, and her husband, his name was Philip, he was the king of Spain. He said this, I felt a reasonable regret for her death. Wow. So he wasn't like heartbroken. You couldn't say, like, well, maybe in a few years I'll be able to date again. You know, he's like, oh, I kind of regret that she's gone, you know. Well, anyway, the English were sick and tired of Roman Catholicism. They didn't want to have anything to do with it at all. And so they welcomed, when Mary died, they welcomed her sister in 1558. Elizabeth I, another one of Henry VIII's children, to the throne. And she served for almost 45 years is how long she was the queen. And so under Elizabeth, Protestantism moved forward as the established religion of the realm. Kind of a fun fact. One of our states, one of the original 13 colonies, is actually named after Elizabeth. Does anyone know which state that would be? Virginia. Why is it Virginia?
Well, she never married.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say anything else.
Right. Yes. Yeah. We'll assume the best, and so therefore she was called the Virgin Queen. That's right. Yeah. So that's how we have the name of. That's how we have that state was named. Elizabeth, she passed an act of supremacy in 1559, which made her the supreme governor in all temporal and spiritual matters. The Pope didn't like this. He teamed up with the Spanish and sent the Spanish Armada to bring the Queen and her subjects back to the church in 1558. Did it succeed? It did not succeed. That's right. They were ruined by that, really. Now, one requirement of the Elizabethan religious settlement was to force Anglican pastors to accept the prayer book and the 39 Articles. So it's like, once she decided, we're not going to be Catholic, we're going to be this new thing, we're going to be the Church of England, Anglicanism, it was necessary for her to force conformity to that religious settlement. Does that make sense? We're not going to be Catholic, but we have to all agree on this. So the requirement was to assent to the full Book of Common Prayer, like this is the way that you're going to lead worship and you'll lead the churches, and to the 39 Articles as well. Now, many pastors resisted this. They were unhappy with the new settlement. And so this is the most important sentence about understanding this next thing we'll move into. There was a group of English Protestants who were dissatisfied with the degree to which the English church had distanced itself from Catholicism. Some said that within the English Protestant church, the Anglican church, the, quote, rags of popery remained. That's not something you put on the back of your toilet, right? What is this popery? The Pope, right? Popish things, popish matters, right? Now, they eventually became known as the Pure Ones or the Puritans. That's how we have the name, the Puritans. So, all right, let's get specific. What were the things within the new Protestantism of England that were unsatisfactory to the Puritans? What were the impurities that remained in the Church of England? Well, there were three major ones. Number one, there were various ceremonies that are prescribed in the Book of Church, not the Book of Church Order, that's the PCA, the Book of Common Prayer. There's issues there too, but so there were things that they really disliked about the Book of Common Prayer, and they rebelled against those. Secondly, was church government. The Puritans were all, at the beginning, they were all Presbyterians. They did not like Episcopalianism. You see, Episcopalianism is a form of church government where you have local pastors like myself here. I'm the pastor of this church. Imagine there being a higher level of pastor over me that I have to listen to, right? I have to obey him. I have to do as he says. This is what's known as a bishop, right? So a bishop is a pastor, is a single pastor over a group of however many, 20, 30, 50, 1,000 pastors. And then usually above the bishop, you have an archbishop. You see, it's a very steep hierarchy, and everybody in the lower level has to abide by whatever whatever they're told from someone in the higher level, right? The Puritans hated that. They didn't like it. They said this is the new popery, right? This is just having another pope, right? And instead of having one pope, you have all these bishops everywhere. So that was something they couldn't stomach. And then thirdly, they thought it was a travesty that there was not faithful preaching and exposition of God's word in English pulpits, right? So to them, it was simply not enough for you to come to church, go through the Book of Common Prayer, and we'll have a reading. This morning, we're going to read Isaiah 58 and 1 John chapter 2, and, go through it in kind of a set course, and over a few years, you'll hear the whole Bible read. That wasn't enough for them. They said, no, God's word has to be understood, explained, and applied to the people of God. So that was huge for them. They said, this is awful, and the Reformation will never do good to this nation until we're fully reformed. We don't want to be halfly reformed. Isn't that a good word? That was how they call it, halfly reformed. We want to be fully reformed. Now, we'll go in on this one a little bit because it will help you understand what some of their concerns were. What were some of these things in the Book of Common Prayer that they rejected? Well, there were 4 major elements in the Book of Common Prayer that the Puritans rejected. The first one was the use of wedding rings in marriage ceremonies. Now, I've already kind of given you the answer if you read it, but it'd be interesting to quiz you on this. So it sounds maybe arbitrary. What's wrong with a wedding ring? Y'all are just being Puritans, Well, they had a reason for it. Number one, they wanted to dispel the idea that marriage was a sacrament. You see, the Roman Catholic Church taught that there were not 2 sacraments, the Lord's Supper and baptism, but that there were 7 sacraments. And one of those sacraments in the Catholic Church is marriage. And the Puritans said, no, marriage is holy, it is undefiled, it is good, it's a wonderful blessing of God, but it shouldn't be classified as a sacrament. They thought that the wedding ring fed that false idea. The second thing they objected to in the Book of Common Prayer was kneeling to receive the Lord's Supper, right? A lot of churches today, I went to a Lutheran church a few years ago, just visiting when we were on vacation, and everybody knelt to receive the Lord's Supper. The Puritans believed that this gave people the idea that receiving the bread and wine is this idea of actually venerating the host, right? So it was the idea that we're not on our knees to venerate God, but we're actually venerating the physical thing that we're about to eat, which is very transubstantiation, They didn't like that. Thirdly, ministers wearing what's called the surplice, which is it's like a white tent or a gown that Anglican priests wear. So the Puritans believed that for the clergy to wear something different implied that the clergy were higher than you, right? Like we wear this holy stuff over here. Y'all wear just your commoner clothes. The Puritans hated that. They didn't like it. They didn't like that at all. And they thought that it perpetuated the idea that because I'm holy and I'm wearing this beautiful robe and everything, I'm a priest, sort of like an Old Testament priest. The Puritans didn't like that. In fact, I noticed that in the PCA there are in more formal PCA churches there are a lot who wear a robe, and I don't agree with that. I don't wear a robe. I don't own a robe. But the reason I don't is because I don't like the idea of, well, I'm wearing something different from what I should wear my nice Sunday clothes, but not wear something different. I did get a clarification from a friend who studies these things a lot, and he said, well, the idea behind the Puritan robe, and the Puritan ministers would wear a jet black robe that covered their body, really. The reason they did it is because they didn't want you to be distracted by anything you were wearing. They wanted you to be just very plain up in front of them. And I said, okay, I take the point. Now, I don't agree, but it would be very distracting maybe if a pastor had like a big shiny, I don't know, something, cross or something on his lapel, and you were just looking at the lapel for the whole service, So I think they had good intentions. That's not one of where I have done. But anyway, that's the idea. And then the last thing they didn't like is that prior to baptism, they would take the water and they would mark the sign of the cross on the applicant's forehead. Any of you received baptism that way, where they did something like that? Their objection to this is they said, we must not add to what the word requires, especially the sacraments. The Bible does not say you should do this. And so if the Bible does not say you should do it, then God forbid we should do it or try to bind someone's conscience and say, if you're going to do a proper baptism, you have to do this. The Bible doesn't say that, and so they were not going to do it. Now, under the next king, who was James the First, King James the First, the Puritans tried, after Elizabeth died, of course, the Puritans tried to kind of get in good with him and persuade him to go from being a halfly Reformed church to a fully Reformed Puritan church. And it didn't happen. He didn't like the Puritans, right? He thought they were too precise. In fact, one person, they were called I think the pronunciation is the Precisians, those who are so completely precise in their practice of religion. In fact, a great line from these debates and things that were happening back then is someone said, you are so precise in the way you worship and serve God. Why is that? And the Puritans' response, he said, we serve a precise God. So we believe that we should be precise. We want to worship him according to the way that he is revealed to us in the Word. Now, he didn't do anything to help their cause. The only thing that he did is he issued the most famous book in the history of the world. I mean, in terms of editions of the Bible, the King James is far beyond any other book that has ever been. So what he did is he granted them permission and I think resources, money, for them to get together some of their best scholars with the Greek and Hebrew and to create this new edition of the Bible, which came out in 1611, which is I think it's a wonderful translation. It is, I think we have to admit, it's an outdated translation because people don't talk that way. And for the Puritans, it was I would argue that the Puritans would say, if you're doing a translation in 2019, do not use Elizabethan English. That's ridiculous. The whole point of the Bible being understood is it needs to be in the vernacular. It needs to be in your language, right? So I believe if God's Word were written today, it would talk about your smartphone and it would talk about Netflix. In terms of like, say, Jesus teaching and using metaphors, I believe that's true. And it's the same thing with our Bible translations. So when he died, when James the First died, his son Charles the First took over, King Charles, and he had, an embattled relationship with the Parliament. Right, so this, in our political context, think of the president against Congress or something like that. I say embattled kind of being a little bit punny because the king rallied an army and declared war on Parliament when they rallied their army. And so the country was at civil war from 1642 to 1651. And near the end of at the very end of Charles's reign, and near the end of the Civil War, Charles was arrested, tried by his people, and executed. Did you know that? Did you know that a monarch of England was beheaded by his people? That's true. In fact, if you, it was in 1649, January 28th, I believe, 1649, he was beheaded. Nicole looks at me, she's like, how do you know that? You don't don't know what we did yesterday, but you remember the day when Charles was executed. Well, honey, that was a big deal, Matthew Henry, this great commentator on the Bible, his father, Philip, was present when Charles was beheaded, and he said, "A moan, as I never heard before, and desire I may never hear again, rose from the assembled crowd." A gasp. I mean, that's pretty weighty. I mean, think about executing. Think about being present, and there's a firing squad who executes Donald Trump right in front of you. I'm sure some people would be okay with that. But, boy, to kill a monarch, if you're godly, I mean, if you believe the Bible, that is an unbelievably sobering thought. When the Bible says that it is God who's put the authorities over you, and you're not to govern yourself. Well, so with his execution, the country had no king for about 11 years. This period is known as the interregnum. Interregnum means between kings. And the country was practically led and ruled by an extraordinarily capable military leader whose name was Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell, yes. He was very, very capable. But when he died, the country fell into disorder for a period of a couple of years. His son didn't have the leadership that he had. Country fell into chaos, and so godly rule failed. It was like the Puritans had a little window to actually rule the nation and to do it in a godly way and move England in a fully reformed, godly direction, and they failed. It didn't happen. That was their shot, and they missed out on it. And so by the year 1660, the country realized they had made a mistake, and they invited Charles I's son, who became Charles II. They invited him to come back and to rule the country. So again, England was under the authority of a king. Charles II ascended the throne and opposed the Puritans at almost every point. He had no time for the Puritans, no sympathy. He was a playboy. He spent so much money. And today we would say he ran up $20 trillion of national debt. I mean, it was that sort of a thing. 2 years after he came to the throne, he returned in May 24th, 1660, and came back, and he made a lot of promises. I'm not going to hold it against anybody that you killed my dad 11 years ago. Don't worry. We'll let bygones be bygones. I'm going to give religious liberty to everybody. He made these sorts of promises. He did not keep them. In the backlash, I don't remember the number. I want to say 30-something people were executed for their complicity in the execution of his father. And in 1662, he required nonconformists. These were, I have to explain that. A nonconformist is a person who does not conform to the practices of the English church. So anybody who didn't fall in line with the Church of England was known as a nonconformist or a dissenter. You're dissenting from the state church. He required them to come into line. When they didn't, he threw 2,000 of them out of their churches on August 24th, 1662. This was an event known as the Great Ejection. So these Puritans who had been settled in their pastorates for many of them for 10 years or more were thrown out on the street. And instead he put in these Church of England, these Anglicans in their place. Now, one of the most beautiful incidents happened at this time through something really horrible, something beautiful about the Puritans in the midst of something awful for the nation. And it was the plague, bubonic plague. Back in the Middle Ages, at one point it wiped out a third of the population of Europe. And there would be outbreaks throughout time. Later, of course, we realize it's through rats and things like that, and mice and rodents that are spreading this horrible thing. Well, bubonic plague swept through London in 1665 and killed people by the tens of thousands. In the official state, the Anglican pastors who'd been reinstalled in these churches, they fled. They went to the countryside. And the Puritans saw this as an opportunity and a challenge. Do you take your call to serve as a pastor seriously? And if so, prove it by staying and serving. And so they ministered to the sick and the dying. I'm sure it's a very. I'm going to say something, and maybe it's not wise to say it. Maybe it is, but I hope you'll receive it in the right spirit. Because I have heroes like the Puritans. It was 2 years ago was when Irma came. Is that right? Hurricane Irma. And for Nicole, you might remember that initially, as this thing started coming in, it was headed right toward Miami, and they would say it's going to go west, east, but it looked like it was going to hit us directly, winds 150, 160 miles an hour. When Nicole and I talked about what we were going to do, it was a non-issue if I was going to stay. That was not even in question. Of course I'm going to stay. The question is, do we relocate Nicole and the kids? But to me, it felt a little bit like this sort of thing, like this could be awful for my church and for this area. Am I just going to, we had the resources, we had the money and the ability to leave, but am I just going to leave my church when this thing could happen? It wasn't even a question. It was just, all right, let's get her to safety. But so anyway, I'm thankful for the Puritans' influence on my life, because I read these things, and it's like, of course, you stay when the plague comes to town, that sort of thing. So anyway, that's a little part of, one way that they've kind of influenced me. Well, ironically, it was through another tragedy that the plague was really eradicated, and it was known as the Great Fire of London. It broke out in 1666, which was a bonanza for people who were like, the end times, 666, Well, it destroyed about 13,000 residences, which was where 70 out of 80,000 residents of London lived. This was a devastating fire. However, it also stopped the plague. And with the cessation of the plague, the Anglicans returned, and the Puritans were again thrown out of their pulpits. You see, so the Puritans, when the plague came to town, the state pastors fled. They went to the countryside for their health, and the Puritans came and they served people who were sick and who were dying. The fire comes, drives out the plague. Anglicans return and drive out the Puritans, right? So they were again thrown out. They didn't have Social Security. They didn't have food stamps in those days. So you had many, many Puritans who were thrown out yet again, and thrown on God. Thrown on God to meet their needs. And so for the next 20 years or so, nonconformists were fined at various times. Many of them were imprisoned for their convictions and for their practices. Sometimes debilitating fines would be levied against people for recusancy. Anyone know the word recusancy? Recusancy means failure to go to church, right? Okay, so not going to church, that was a finable offense in England in those days. Not from the Puritans, from the Anglicans, right? So that's one that's kind of the one reality of having a state church. And so many Puritans saw the inside of jail cells. Who's the most famous Puritan who went to jail? Together, exactly, John Bunyan. Bunyan, that's right. Yeah. So now technically, this is getting a little... So technically, Bunyan was actually not a Puritan, because a Puritan was a person... I'm about to get to this. So hold that for a minute. I'll explain in a moment why Bunyan was not a Puritan. He was a nonconformist. He was a dissenter. He was not a Puritan. Well, finally, after all of this, about 30 years after Charles comes to the throne, England, in a groundbreaking in Western history, England passed an edict known as the Edict of Toleration in 1689, where they said, live and let live. As long as you are a Trinitarian Protestant, you may worship as you see fit. Catholics did not receive full liberty to serve as Catholics until the 1830s. Now, this is a heartbreak. Jews were not allowed in England until the 1830s. It wasn't well, you can be here, but don't practice. You're not allowed here, right? So again, I hope one thing you take away from this and from this class is the idea of how new and innovative these ideas that you can think as you want, you can worship as you want. That's a new thing in the religious landscape, even of the West. Well, anyway, my goodness, time flees so quickly. Well, so the Edict of Toleration in 1689, which, by the way, if any of you care, my area of focus was from 1660 to 1689 in the Edict of Toleration, in the way John Flavel, the way there were some changes in how he preached before and leading up to that point in time, in the way he preached evangelistically. Ask me later if you want to know more, and I would be glad to speak about it. Well, in all, the Puritan effort, I'm about to explain what a Puritan is. The Puritan effort lasted about 130 years, from roughly the late 1550s until 1689, when you didn't have to conform to the Church of England anymore, and the movement was a failure. So it didn't work, right? They weren't able to reform the nation in a way that they saw fit. Now, there were English and there were American Puritans, right? But they were a different thing. So you had Puritans in England, but you also had Puritans who were in America. Now, one point of confusion is a lot of people imagine the Puritans getting on the Mayflower, right? Getting on the Mayflower and coming to the colonies to do their religious thing. That's actually not true. There's a difference between a Puritan and a separatist. Okay? The Pilgrims, so my grandfather was William Bradford. He was our great-great-great-grandfather. Was on the Mayflower and was the governor of Massachusetts. Was William Bradford. He was a separatist. Okay? He was not a Puritan. So the idea behind a Puritan is a man or a woman who says, we're going to stay in the church. We're going to stay in the Church of England, in this case, and we're going to purify it from within. Right? We're going to hang in there. We don't want this denomination to go liberal. We're going to stay in there and pray and work and labor and strive so that it's reformed from the inside. Okay? You hear the word purity, right? You're trying to purify it. Now, that happens a lot today. I'm sure all of you probably know people. And you ask them, you say, why are you still in that liberal church? They don't believe in Jesus anymore. And a lot of well-meaning Christians, what do they say? They say, I'm hanging in there. Like, I really am praying and hoping that God's going to return the church to what it used to believe. But I'm hanging in there. And sometimes they get to a point where they say, I can't anymore, and they break away. So that's the difference between a Puritan and a separatist. A Puritan was one who said, let's purify. We're going to hang in there with the Church of England. A separatist is one who said, forget it. We'll go do something else. A lot of nonconformists went to the Netherlands and they went to the colonies and they broke away and they separated so they could start their own pure churches in the Netherlands and in England. Now, the reason Bunyan, as I mentioned a moment ago, the reason Bunyan was a dissenter or a nonconformist and not a Puritan is because why? Why was he not a Puritan? What's that?
He left the church.
He did, and he was what was his denomination? It starts with a Baptist. Oh, okay. He was a Baptist, yeah. So you see, the Baptists were the ones who, they formed a different congregation. They said, I don't agree with any of that. So he was a separatist, really. So anyway, that's a little bit about those differences. Let me, we just have a couple minutes. Let me give you a couple of paragraphs about that will help describe what did a Puritan look like. You know, what was true of a typical Puritan. Well, here's an example of we've covered that. Here's an example of a Puritan by the name of John Howe. This is what was said of this pastor, John Howe, at his funeral service. A friend spoke at the service and said this. His congregation was inclined to melt under his holy fervors, like his passion for God and for God's word. His prayers and other ministerial performances had that strange pungency, that aroma, that quickness and authority with them at sometimes, that softness, gentleness, sweetness, and alluringness at others, that one would think it hardly possible to resist the power and spirit wherewith he spoke. You see, Hal's congregation was spiritually alive because of Hal's passion and his love for Jesus, and how on the one hand he could be so tough and solid in terms of defending the truth of the gospel, but over here on the other hand he could be so tender-hearted with those who were broken, with those who needed their wounds bound up by a gentle pastor. So he managed that balance really well. And then, somewhat convicting, he wrote this: besides Hal's usual exercise on Sunday of praying, preaching the word, catechizing, teaching the catechism, right? Reading the word and administering the sacraments, he usually 5 days per week, early in the morning, appeared in public. He prayed, preached a sermon on a portion of the word, visited the sick eagerly, and all the families in his charge, laboring to understand the present state of their souls. He applied himself to them in instructions, reproofs, admonitions, exhortation, encouragement, etc., to find out, what they were learning from his preaching, what they were not learning, what they were needing or not getting from his preaching. His whole heart was in his work, and he was up each morning at 3 or sooner, and to be with God, which was his dear delight, while others slept. Like, that's great. I want to be a pastor and a man like that. I really want to be. I mean, not necessarily the 3, maybe 3:30, I'm going to aim for that at least. J.I. Packer, he said this in this class on Puritanism. Puritans accounted perspicuity. What's perspicuity? Clearness. Clarity from the pulpit when someone is teaching or explaining. Puritans accounted perspicuity, clearness, one of the best graces in a preacher. He must be clear, give understanding, make his teaching memorable, conducive to the heart, right, to the affection, head and heart. Good preaching evokes assent of mind, consent of the will, and affection of the heart. Preaching should make people love the Lord more and have joy, and provide them with energy for the journey. So the Puritans, being so concerned about the importance of good preaching, this was a little bit of what they believed about the preaching, that it should be clear, that it should be understandable, that it should be applied with the gospel. You have to touch people's minds, inform their minds and touch their hearts, so that their will be changed, and they'll want to go out and serve the Lord faithfully. If we only inform the mind, if pastors like me only inform the mind, you've failed. If you only stir up the heart and you don't inform the mind, you've failed. If you only beat on the will and say, this week, you better get out there and do, you've failed. Right? We have to have all. We need our minds to be enlightened in truth. We need our hearts to be stirred up so that our affections and our love for Jesus and for others grows. And then we need to be told, okay, in light of God's mercies, in view of God's mercies, we need to get out and make an impact on the world. If pastors are not doing that, and if congregants are not doing it as well, all three, then there's a breakdown, there's a failure. I've given you a couple book recommendations. I'll give you just a couple of little, some Puritan one-liners, if you will, from John Flavel. And this is out of the little book that I had published with Banner of Truth. Just a few things that John Flavel, one Puritan, he wrote. Christ is bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, a garment to the naked, healing to the wounded, and whatever a soul can desire is found in him. New wonders, here's another one. New wonders will appear in Christ if we behold him to eternity. I really believe that. I believe that when we see the Lord's face, which is what Revelation 22:4 says, there will be new beauties that we will see in our God 100 trillion years from now, throughout eternity. Here's another one that we might take to heart. God allows his children to complain to him, but not of him. We ever do that? Complain to God? God, why is it thus? To use Elizabethan English. The Lord is fine with us complaining to him, but not about him, not of him. And lastly, he says, away to thy God, poor Christian. Get you into your closet. Puritans, they would go into closets and pray. They didn't want to be seen by others. That was secret between them and the Lord. Get into your prayer closet and pour out your soul before him. And that ease, the ease which you seek in vain elsewhere, will there be found or no. Ease and rest for your soul. The Puritans were a praying people. Well, where to begin with the Puritans? It's not self-promoting, because if you buy this, I don't get anything from it. I don't get $1 more from it. They gave me a little bit of money at the beginning for doing it. I don't get a commission or whatever. But this little book of quotations by Flavel is good. Pick that up, and if you like it, then maybe you could move on to The Mystery of Providence, which is also by John Flavel. Both of these are very short. I mean, the one that I had that they published is very small. Mystery of Providence is maybe 150 pages long. It's not very, very big. The Puritans, some of them were known for being extraordinarily verbose and wordy. Stephen Charnock wrote a magnificent treatment of God called The Existence and Attributes of God. It is at least 1,500 pages thick, 9-point type, all the way to the edge of the pages. It'll write 120 pages on the wisdom of God. You know, you have to have a magnifying glass to read all of this. The knowledge of God. Practical atheism. I taught when I was a youth director many years ago, I taught it was like a youth talk on practical atheism. And I got it from Charnock. I told them, I said, yeah, Charnock says this, and I want to elaborate on it, explain it. He basically said, if you look at most people, you would think they were an atheist. If you look at most Christians, you would think that they're an atheist. The way they actually live. I mean, the things that, think of the worry that comes in their hearts. Think of the fear. Think of their disbelief again and again. And I dare say that's true of all of us, that very often we really act like atheists, that we really don't believe that there is a God who is big, who is wise, who's loving, who's in charge. And then I couldn't believe a few years later, I think he's the pastor of the biggest church in America. It's called Craig Groeschel. We have like 100,000 members on all these different campuses. He wrote a book called The Christian Atheist. And all it is he took Charnock and he wrote a best-selling book about it. I'm like, that's not fair. He just got that from Charnock, It's like when I was the youth director, I should have stolen Charnock's idea and not given him credit, So anyway, those are some places to start. Any questions before we conclude? Yes, Mrs. Boudreaux.
Well, on the point of kneeling to serve the Lord's Supper, so they rejected that, the Puritans.
Yes, when they would take it. Yes.
So they rejected the idea of kneeling to pray as well, because I often wonder why we don't, as Protestants, kneel to pray during worship.
I don't know why Protestants today. Do you mean in public worship?
Yes.
Because I know a lot of Christians do pray in their closet. However many of us have prayer closets. I don't know the answer to that. You see in Anglican churches and Catholic churches, Lutheran churches, kneelers right in front of you. Push it down, and you. So I don't know why we don't do that. The specific rejection of kneeling when receiving the Lord's Supper, the specific reason was because they thought that lent credence to the idea that this host, the bread and the wine, are the physical body of Christ. But does anyone have any ideas on that? I don't know the answer. Why is it that Protestants today don't say, get on your knees, we're going to pray? It would be an appropriate thing.
Well, as you brought that up, it might just be a practical reason that the kneelers were there.
Right,
and
right,
they might just want to do it during the service, the taking of the Lord's Supper.
Right.
The Lord's Supper is always taken at the altar, never in the seat.
But in the Anglican church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Catholic church.
Yeah, in Lutheran too, I know.
So the kneeler was always meant for. It was never
Right,
meant
yeah.
for communion. Because in the Catholic church they stand to take communion.
Right, yeah.
I know the Episcopal church is that you kneel, you go up to the front, you take turns and kneel in front.
Right, yeah. And I can now. This is an educated guess, but it is a guess. I could be wrong. Is people like the Puritans and the evangelical movement, we don't like the idea of people being forced to do something that they don't feel like doing. So the idea of everybody get down on your knees, it's like, look, that needs to come from my heart. And if I want to get on my knees and worship, I'll do it. But and I'm not comfortable with that. I don't like, if I'm.
I don't think you're forced to do it anyway.
Sure, I understand. Yeah. It's like that sort of thing should come from the heart. Like I've visited churches where they're like, all right, everybody put your hands in the air. I'm like, I'm not putting my hands in the air. I mean, not just because I'm an ornery jerk mostly, but if that's going to come out of my heart, that should be my response of worship to the Lord, but not because you're like, all right, if you really love God, your hands are going to go high. So anyway. I'm a modern day Puritan. I mean, there are certain things that I disagree with them on. They were very strict on the Sabbath. They believe you should not recreate. You should not have recreation on the Sabbath. That's about the only point theologically that I would differ with them, as well as them believing that a church-state liaison was a legitimate thing. I don't agree with that. So, Rich, yes.
A little bit after the Puritans came over, the Germans were coming into Pennsylvania. The so-called Pennsylvania Dutch. Was there something similar going on in Germany that made them have to leave?
Yes. So the equivalent to an English Puritan is a German pietist. So pietism and the Moravian movement, that was kind of the equivalent over on the continent. You also had something similar within Calvinism. I forget the name in the Reformed churches on the continent, but pietism was it started later. It started well after the Puritan movement in the next century. But there were people within Lutheranism that I can't after so many things. So. Once Luther and the early reformers, once they kind of settled in on their theology, the Lutheran churches and the Reformed churches across the continent moved into a period of, here's our kind of central starting point as Lutherans and as Reformed. And gradually they built up over time these enormous theological structures and systems where you've got some of these authors who are writing 3 and 5 volume tomes in Latin on their theology. You had this even down in Italy. You had guys like Francis Turretin and William Ames and Peter Van Maastricht and these other. I was actually in church in California a few weeks ago and someone quoted Peter Van Maastricht. I'm like, dang, dude, that's impressive. But what happened was over time within Lutheranism, to specifically answer your question, is these theologians had gotten to a point where they were slicing and dicing and thricing, and I mean, that's not even a word, but they were going so deep and precise on their theology that it turned cold. Many people thought that this, what was called the High Orthodox period in church history, things had grown cold, and they were just concerned about dotting every I and crossing every T, but it was sort of like the heart had evacuated out of the Christian faith. And so you had the pietism by Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. Maybe you've heard of Zinzendorf, who started the Moravian movement. You had Philip Spener. You had these other leaders that said we need a warm-hearted, devotional reverence for Christ, and not just one where our theology is precise. So the Germans had the ability to do what a lot of people in Reformed theology have done as well. So, and then, I mean, you have the Baptists and like following Arminius, and like they didn't. Never mind. I better stop. Yes.
The Pilgrims, whether they were Puritans or whether they were separatists.
Yeah.
Isn't it true that, especially in New England, it was illegal to work on Sundays or to not go to church on Sunday, and that kind of led to the witch trials of anyone that didn't conform? So if they had rebelled against the legalism,
Yeah.
how come then they came here and kind of imposed their own form of legalism?
So my caveat is I don't know anything about New England Puritanism. So I don't know. It's really I guess a silly thing, but the joke is I don't know anything at all about English history before 1660 or after 1689. I just don't really know anything. So that's a joke. I do know. I've studied a little bit of Puritanism in New England. Not very much. I mean, I know about Salem witch trials and things like that. The critique, the really graceless critique, I think, of a lot of Puritanism in New England is really unfounded in terms of some of the Connecticut Blue Laws and things like that. There was a scholar in the 1930s who is a historian of music, of all things, who started to study the Puritan movement, and he wrote a book. His name was Percy Scholes. Isn't that a great old-fashioned name? Percy Scholes. He wrote a book called The Puritans and Music, and it ended up being a very cogent rebuttal of people who have just poo-pooed the Puritans and said they were killjoys. It's worth reading. I actually have a copy in my library. It's very good. But Percy Scholes, he said, I was reading all about the Puritans and looking for these dour, grim, morose, unkind, hard-hearted Puritans. And he said it was like I was looking for the dead body, and I realized that there had never been a murder in the first place. So a lot of that critique is really overblown. You had some who I would say they were extremists, and they went too far. You had complicity of the execution of some. I think there were maybe 8 people killed at Salem in the witch trials. That's horrible. There's no excuse for that. But then, if you remember back to the earlier lectures and you see that everybody believed that a crime of heresy was a crime against the state, those sorts of things, it doesn't excuse it, but at least it helps us make sense why they would do something like that. This judge who was the president of Harvard, his name was Judge Sewall, he was one of the judges, or he might have been the judge that presided over that. He repented later, and he came out and he said, that was wrong what we did. He also read a lot of Flavel and valued Flavel's books. He didn't get that from Flavel, I promise. That's nowhere in Flavel that we should kill witches, So anyway, I don't know if that helps, but that's a little stab at it. Marilyn, yes. Oh, this will be the last one since I have to be in a meeting in 2 minutes.
So when the pilgrims came to look for a new, they asked King James. King James was the king when the pilgrims came, right?
Yeah. So 1620 was when the Mayflower sailed, and at that time. Let's see, James died in 1629. So he was, yeah.
So
I think it was
they have
1629.
the new Bible and everything, why they were looking to create a new church? That's what they were asking King James, and King James didn't give them the opportunity to do that. So they came here. Were they Puritan? Were they separatists?
Yeah. So
What church they wanted to create?
Yeah, so they wanted to form a church that was distinct from the Church of England. They said, we want to just take our Bibles and come up with a church where we can a fully reformed church where we can faithfully serve God. That was their intention. They were not Puritans because they didn't stay within the Church of England.
That's right.
Yeah. If you stay in the church and try to purify it from
They
within.
believe the same thing. They just took a different approach.
That's right.
That's
Yeah.
what she's asking.
Yeah.
Puritan separatists believe the same thing. They just took a different approach.
The separatists believed that it was a good and legitimate thing to actually break away. So, but you're basically right in the outlines of their theology. Yeah, that's right. So, okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week.